Okay, colleagues. So, the last video for today, I want to finish with a discussion of Aristotle. Again, wonderful article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Richard Parry. I highly recommend you read the rest of it. I probably, I'll do the rest of the article once we have studied the Hellenistic schools. We're gonna have a lecture on Hellenism this Saturday, right? So, let me not waste any time and jump right into it. Well, anyway, no. Before I begin reading, let me just note something. So, after the lecture yesterday, lecture on Aristotle, mm, we have discussed the various problems with Aristotle's theory. So, his sexism, his racism, his his prejudice on the one hand, and on the other hand, his teleological worldview. So, his inegalitarian commitments are not something that we share by and large. And also, his teleological view of the world is not something that we share. Um, you know, in the course of the scientific revolution, the mechanistic worldview, the one that de-emphasizes the importance of goals or ends in nature. So, like, no, I shouldn't say de-emphasize. Like in contemporary philosophy of science, I would say within the naturalistic picture of the universe, this is completely banned. Humans may have goals, but nature itself does not. Again, this triumph of the, to some extent, of the sophist relativist perspective, encompassed, I think, best by Hobbes in this phrase that whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which he calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion is not that is what he calls evil. There being nothing simply and absolutely so. So again, so we are anti-Aristotelian in our egalitarian commitments and also in our mechanistic commitments. By and large, of course, there are exceptions. But I want to stress this sort of the way that the article is set up, and I think this is the proper way to approach any philosopher. You need to find what is valuable. Aristotle is not an idiot. Aristotle is a brilliant philosopher. He has all sorts of very interesting insights, and I think every philosopher has flaws. Every philosopher has flaws, and I think the proper procedure, the right way to proceed, is to focus on the productive issues within the philosophy of a given thinker, right? Rather than focus on the things that we find distasteful or offensive or wrong. I just think that's not as productive. It's much. I find it much more appropriate to focus on the strengths, and like in general, when you will be writing your exams, you have to show the strong side of every philosopher before you can criticize them. And I think there's a lot to admire in Aristotle's analysis. So let me proceed with the article. The moral theory of Aristotle, like that of Plato, focuses on virtue, recommending the virtuous way of life by its relation to happiness. So again, virtue equals happiness, and there's a special relation between virtue and philosophy, or maybe virtue and knowledge. Intellectual knowledge for Socrates, or practical wisdom for Aristotle. We'll talk about this in a second. Well, intellectual, for Plato also this, habituation plus the knowledge of the forms. Anyway, Aristotle's most important ethical work, Nicomachean Ethics, or Nicomachean Ethics, I'll probably say Nicomachean Ethics, devotes the first book to a preliminary account of happiness, which is then completed in the last chapters of the final book, Book 10. This account ties happiness to excellent activity of the soul. So happiness is sometimes people say virtue of the soul, or I think a better translation, that happiness is the excellent activity of the soul. I cannot resist this temptation, right? So it's like human beings have capacities, and our proper excellence lies in the exercise of all of our capacities, but especially our highest, most excellent capacities, which are going to be capacities for reason, which, according to Aristotle, human beings alone share. Again, this positive ideal of freedom, right? It's very important. Again, it's like I keep talking about how I would rather be recording this for YouTube rather than, let's say, stuffing my face with ice cream. And I think, this is, and I asked in the lecture yesterday, aren't we all Aristotelians? Yeah, like in this sense, this is very much an Aristotelian motivation on my part. I feel certain, energy or fullness of life. I feel a certain happiness because I know I am doing something worthwhile, something useful, something interesting, and it's more than just merely experiencing pleasure from food or from other substances or something like that. And in general, I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and we're going to talk about this in a second, how this excellent activity of the soul has to require others. You see, I feel what I am doing now to be worthwhile and interesting, and I'm not restricted by society in doing that. I am enabled by society. There is this wonderful person, Richard Parry, who wrote the article. If Richard Parry did not write the article, would not have written the article, I would not be able to deliver this presentation to you. So I would have missed out, right? And so, again, Richard Parry helping me, and I helping you. Also, I don't know, maybe Richard Parry. I'm not sure if he cares about this kind of stuff, but presumably he would be happy that his article gained some traction on YouTube. I'm sure he spent a lot of time and effort writing the article, right? So it's like, in this sense, Richard and me and you, we're all in the same boat. It's a win-win situation. Again, together, we engage in this excellent activity of our soul. Isn't this wonderful? I always, it's like, and notice also, like, I'm doing this over the internet. There were people who assembled this microphone. There are people who assembled my keyboard and the monitor, and people who are putting food on my table. People who are growing, crops so that I can get enough calories, survive, and deliver this lecture. This is such a wonderfully collaborative activity. Okay, of course, we shouldn't forget about Karl Marx and social criticism and Thrasymachus and Callicles as a different lens. But I want you to see that there's something to what Aristotle is saying. Okay, this idea of society as deeply consensual, something that enables the blossoming forth of the individual potential is very much there. And again, Marx is going to be critical vis-a-vis the capitalist society, but Marx's vision of communism, I think, is deeply Aristotelian, and this is among the reasons for us to read Aristotle and to pay close attention to Aristotle. And again, notice how Aristotelian arguments are mostly can be divorced from his personal prejudice. So I mean, Aristotle thought that women have inferior intelligence, but Marx doesn't think that. In communism, people definitely going to be full equality of opportunity, right? In this sense, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? His need or her need, right? So, Marxism and feminism, especially second wave feminism, go hand in hand. Anyway, let me go back to the article. So in subsequent books, Aristotle defines the excellent activity of the soul. He ties the excellent activity of the soul to moral virtues and the virtue of practical wisdom. We'll talk about this moral virtue, because moral virtue can be translated as excellence of character, because more or ethos in Greek actually means something like character, stable character, habit. So moral virtue is like a habit of excellence, an excellent character. And so this is tied to practical wisdom. Again, the Greek word is phronesis or phronesis. And this is different from Platonic contemplation of the forms. Again, so excellence in thinking and deciding about how to behave. This approach to moral theory depends on a moral psychology that shares a number of affinities with Plato. However, while for Plato the theory of forms has a role in justifying virtue, Aristotle notoriously rejects the theory of forms, actually using the arguments that Plato himself presents in his, what we think is potentially later dialogue, Parmenides, especially the third man argument, which is complicated and technical, but I just want to leave this hanging. Anyway, Aristotle grounds his account of virtue in his theory about the soul, a topic to which he devotes a separate treatise. For some reason, so the anima, so on psyche in Greek. Aristotle opens the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics by positing one supreme good as the aim of human actions, investigations, and crafts. The supreme good of human life. The supreme good of human life, Aristotle identifies as happiness. And he immediately notes the variations in the notion, so that different people define happiness differently. Some think that happy life is the life of enjoyment. The more refined think it is the life of political activity. So happiness comes from enjoyment, or maybe it comes from political activity. Others think that life of study or theoretical contemplation. Contemplation is a synonym for the word thinking, if you want. It has a nuance of meaning, but again, contemplation, so, thinking, or philosophizing. The object of the life of enjoyment is bodily pleasure. that of political activity is honor or even virtue. Shouldn't this remind us of the spiritual part of the soul? Yeah, I think it should. The object of life of study is the philosophical or scientific understanding. Arguing that the end of human life must be the most complete. Whoops. Sorry about that. Arguing that the end of human life must be the most complete, he concludes that happiness is the most complete end, whereas pleasure, honor, virtue, and understanding are choice-worthy in themselves. They are chosen for the sake of happiness. So pleasure, honor, and virtue in themselves are good only because they contribute to happiness. Okay? Happiness is not chosen for the sake of anything else. Of course, the way Aristotle puts this relation between happiness and other choice-worthy ends leaves it open whether they're means to or constituents of happiness. So, okay, I jumped the gun a little bit, but still, we are talking about so means or constituents of happiness. So the question is, does, let's say, pleasure, honor, and virtue, do they contribute to happiness or do they constitute happiness? It's a bit of a technical point, so I think we can probably gloss over it. So let me continue. While I'm continuing, I should probably double check. Okay, stream is working. I hope. That would be a disappointment otherwise. Yeah. So next, Aristotle turns his own account of happiness, the summit of Book 1. So this is the focal point of Book 1, Aristotle's account of happiness. The account depends on an analogy with the notion of function or characteristic activity or work, ergon in Greek. So everything in the world has a purpose, a telos, and everything in the world has a proper function, an ergon. And I suppose in an important sense, your telos is exercising your ergon, your function, excellently. Excellent exercise of one's highest faculty or highest function, which again, for human beings, Aristotle thinks is reason. Anyway, so a flutist has a function of work, that is playing the flute. The key idea for Aristotle is that the good of the flute players as such is found in their functioning as a flutist. So an excellent flute player, right? By analogy, if there's a human function, the good for a human is found in this function. Aristotle then turns to the human soul. He argues that in fact, there is a human function to be found in the human soul's characteristic activity, that is reason. So I'm not sure if the article is going to talk about this or not, but Aristotle says that plants only have the vegetative part of the soul that allows them to grow and to take in nutrients. Animals, in addition to that, also have the appetitive part of the soul, which allows them to perceive and to move. So animals have vegetative and appetitive part of the soul. And humans have all three, vegetative, appetitive, and rational part of the soul. But rational part of the soul is exclusive to us. So if we were to live like plants and just eat and grow, this would not be an expression of human excellence. This would maybe this is an excellence of an eggplant, but not an excellence of a human being. Anyway, I mean, it's judgmental, it's hierarchical, it's teleological, yes, and it's controversial for that reason, but, can you make it work even without teleology? Again, Marx, I think, is going to try to make it work in his analysis of communism. Anyway, then, without explanation, Aristotle makes the claim that reason has two importantly distinct aspects. One that has reason directly in itself, and one that obeys or can obey reason. I'm not sure if this is important. So appetites can fail to obey reason, but they at least have the capacity to obey. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure if we need to discuss this in detail. Aristotle then argues that since the function of a human is to exercise the soul's activities according to reason, the function of a good human is to exercise well, and finally, the soul's activities according to reason. Given the two aspects of reason that Aristotle has distinguished, one can see that both can be done well or done badly. On the one hand, one can reason well or badly about what to do within the next 5 minutes, let's say, 24 hours, or within the next 10 years. On the other, actions motivated by appetites can be well or badly done, and likewise, having an appetite at all can sometimes not be a well done by a badly done activity of the soul. So certain appetites, it's just inappropriate to have. And again, through upbringing, hopefully, we can make sure that human beings don't have these appetites. I'll leave it to you to fill in the blank. Acting on the desires for a drink from the wine cooler at a banquet is not always a good idea, nor is having such a desire. According to Aristotle, the good human being has According to Aristotle, the good human being has a soul in which these functions are consistently done well. Thus, a good person reasons well about plans, short-term or long-term, and when they satisfy their appetites, and even when they have appetites, it is in conformity with reason. Returning to the question of happiness, Aristotle says, the good for a human is to live the way the good human lives. That is, to live with one's life aimed and structured by the same thing that the good human being aims at in his or her life. This is a bit tautological, but still. Going back to this idea of pleasures, it's like, imagine a person cannot be happy unless they violently murder others and enjoy the warm splashing of blood on their cheeks. We would say this is not a properly human desire to have, or most people would be inclined to say that. There's something wrong with a person who wants that. Or think of Callicles with his idea of having as many desires and as extravagant desires as possible and trying to satisfy them as much as possible. Again, Aristotle would say that this is not a proper way to structure one's soul. So far, I'm not sure if we're getting a justification of this view, but a sort of a justification we have seen in Plato and in Socrates before him. Anyway, so Aristotle's account of happiness, that is the highest good for a human, is virtuous or excellent activity of the soul. So happiness is the excellent activity of the soul. But Aristotle has not identified this virtuous activity with that of moral virtues at this point. In fact, he says, if there are many kinds of excellence, then human good is found in the active exercise of the highest kind of excellence. He is careful to point out that happiness is not just the ability to function well in this way. It is the activity itself. So not just the ability, but the activity. So not just have the ability, but exercise this ability. Moreover, this activity must be carried out for a complete life. One swallow does not make a spring. Although the reference here to parts or aspects of the soul is cursory, it is influenced by Aristotle's theories in the De Anima. Fundamental to human soul and to all living things, including plants, is nutrition and growth. So this is the nutritive part of the soul, or the vegetative part of the soul. Next is sensation and locomotion. So these are functions and characteristics of animals. This would be the appetitive part of the soul. Aristotle associates appetite and desire with this part of the soul. Thus, we have a rough sketch of animal life. Animals moved by appetite for food go towards the object of desire, which are discerned by sensation. To these functions is added thought in case of humans, so our unique capacity for thought. Thought is both speculative and practical. So thought is both speculative and practical. So this would be philosophical or theoretical reason and practical wisdom. The bulk of the De Anima is devoted to explaining the nutritive, sensory, and rational functions. Aristotle considers desire and appetite as the source of movement in other animals, and these plus reason as its source in humans. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle focuses on the role that appetite and desire, together with reason, play in the moral drama of human life. In chapter 8 of book 1, Aristotle explicitly identifies human good with psychological good, dividing goods into external goods, those of the body, and those of the soul. Again, so we have these external goods, goods of the body, and internal goods, goods of the soul. Again, say hi to higher and lower pleasures of John Stuart Mill. Aristotle states that his account of happiness agrees with those who hold it is a good of the soul. In fact, in this account, happiness is closely related to traditionally conceived psychological goods such as pleasure and moral virtue, although the nature of this relation has yet to be shown. Still, in Book 1, Aristotle is laying the foundation in his moral psychology for showing the link between moral virtues and happiness. In Book 2, he completes this foundation when he turns to the question of which condition of the soul is to be identified with moral virtue or virtue of character. Excellence of character, habitual excellence, right? In Book 2, Chapter 5, Aristotle says that condition of the soul are either feelings, pathe, capacities for feelings, or dispositions. Feelings are such things as appetite, anger, fear, and generally those conditions that are accompanied by pleasure and pain. Capacities, for example, are simple capacity to have these feelings. Finally, disposition is that condition of the soul whereby we are all well off or badly off with respect to feelings. For instance, people are badly disposed with respect to anger, who typically get angry violently or who typically get angry weakly. Virtue as a condition of the soul will be one of these three. After arguing that virtue is neither feeling nor capacity, Aristotle turns to what it means to be well or badly off with respect to the feelings. He says that in everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more, less, or an equal amount. So that we're going to talk about the the doctrine of the golden mean. I'm going to have an important comment with respect to it in a second. This remark is puzzling until we realize that he's actually talking about feelings. Feelings are continuous and divisible, so one can take more, less, or an equal amount of them. Presumably, when it comes to feeling anger, so this is very important. When it comes to feeling anger, for example, one can feel too much anger, not very much, or a balanced amount. So notice for Aristotle, against the Buddhists and against the Christians, Aristotle thinks that you can have not enough anger. You can have a vice of not being angry enough. Aristotle thinks that what counts as too much, not very much, or a balanced amount can vary to some extent from individual to individual and depending on the circumstances. At this point, he's ready to come back to moral virtue for its concern with feelings and actions. To have a feeling like anger at the wrong time. So it's important to have a feeling of anger at the right time, for the right reason, towards the right people, for the right purpose, and in the right manner, is to feel the right amount, the mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. This is the mark of moral virtue. Wow, this is interesting. Again, Aristotelean notion. You could imagine Socrates saying in his ascetic fashion that he just never gets angry. And maybe this is the goal in life, like to never get angry. Or, a Christian or a Buddhist ascetic could say, or ascetic, right, could say that, the purpose of life is to never get angry. But Aristotle, in this teleological, naturalistic fashion, says, no, human beings do get angry. And nature does nothing in vain. Nature has given us the capacity to feel angry, and it means that there are appropriate occasions to feel anger. You have to feel anger at the right time, on the right occasion, towards the right people, for the right purpose, and in the right manner. Wow, this is interesting. And again, when I mentioned in the lecture that we're all Aristotelians, I would imagine most people I know would agree with this statement. That on certain occasions, towards the right people, for the right reason, you should feel angry. And if you do not feel angry, there's something wrong with you. So in this sense, I think that our sort of the common sense of our culture is very much aligned with what Aristotle is saying here. And opposed to many other more extreme philosophical alternatives, such as, I'm thinking about asceticism first and foremost. Finally, virtue, and okay, so interesting question, interesting problem. Let's think about this, right? Finally, virtue is not a question only of feelings, but also of action. Presumably, Aristotle means appropriate feeling. Well, again, I hope appropriate feeling gives rise to appropriate action. Yeah, this is a technical point. At last, Aristotle is ready to discuss particular moral virtues. Beginning with courage, he mentions two feelings, fear and confidence. So again, like with anger, you should not be too angry. You should not be not angry enough, right? But there's an appropriate amount of anger, right? Likewise, there's an appropriate amount of courage between the extremes of cowardice and rashness. And this is the doctrine of the golden mean. So, and now we can discern the link between morality and happiness. While happiness itself is excellent or virtuous activity of the soul, moral virtue is a disposition to achieve the mean between the two extremes in feeling and in action. Wow, this is probably the most important phrase, okay? This is clearly like the most important phrase with regards to Aristotle. Happiness itself is the excellent or virtuous activity of the soul, and moral virtue, so the excellence of character, is a disposition to act so as to achieve the mean between the extremes, so in a habitual manner, a habit of choosing the mean between extremes. The missing link is that achieving the mean is also excellent activity of the soul. Activity that expresses virtue of courage, for example, is also the best kind of activity when it comes to emotion of fear. Activity that expresses the virtue of moderation is excellent when it comes to bodily appetites. In this way, the happy person is also the virtuous person. The happy person is also the virtuous person. However, in Book 1, Aristotle has already pointed out the problem of bodily and external goods in relation to happiness, even if happiness is virtuous activity of the soul. In some cases, these goods are needed to be virtuous. This is another question. So the Hellenistic philosophers, whom we'll talk about later, or Socrates, seems to say that the only thing you need for happiness is the virtue of the soul. And Aristotle seems to imply that you need external goods, and not just external goods, but like external circumstances. So these goods are needed to be virtuous. For example, one must have money to be generous. So you need to have good birth. You need to have good children. You need to have beauty. You need to be a handsome person. Maybe you need to have a deep voice and a long beard. Well, again, so, you can try to extend this to women as well. So an ugly, low-born, solitary, or childless would not be a happy person for Aristotle, and even less so if he has friends and children who are bad, or good friends and children who then die. So you see, our happiness is very much dependent on external circumstances. In fact, I think Aristotle implies that even after you yourself have died, you are already dead, but then something bad happens to your children, you become less happy. So there's very much this insistence on the dependence of your happiness, of your life as a whole, on external circumstances. And again, we'll talk next time about Hellenistic philosophies, right, who live in in the age of chaos and civil war and civil strife after the Alexander the Great dies and his empire, is partitioned among his generals. And this would sound, what's the right phrase, like an evil joke, I think, to people living after the death of Alexander the Great, because for most people it's a question of extraordinary luck, extraordinary external luck, whether you can achieve happiness or not. It would just, it's not that they refute Aristotle's philosophy. It's just that this philosophy would just sound completely inhumane in this fashion. But again, our ideal, aren't we Aristotelians? Don't we want these things? Don't we want to have a good birth, good children, beauty? Don't we want our children to succeed even after we die? Don't we think that if you decide to be child-free, you're missing out on some portion of life? Now, when I say don't we think, of course, there are obviously exceptions, right? And including this later position that a lot of people are child-free. And it's a good question, what precisely are the reasons? I think from a Marxist perspective, one could argue that, it could be that people are driven to these positions simply because our society is not a well-functioning society. And many people, I'm sure, are wary of having children simply because this world does not seem to be at home. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but I'm sure sometimes or often this is the case. Well, at least as far as I can tell. Anyway, so Aristotle is raising a problem that he does not attempt to solve. Even if happiness is virtuous activity of the soul, it does not confer immunity to the vicissitudes of life. Okay. So in an important respect, I think this is the most important part, and I think we have gotten most of the mileage from the article. I think we're going to finish the article in a second. But sort of, if you're finding the video too long, now is a good time to take a break. But let me continue. So Aristotle's moral psychology has further implications for his account of happiness. In Book 1, Chapter 7, he said that human good is virtuous activity of the soul, but was indefinite about the virtues. In most of the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about moral virtues, leaving the impression that virtuous activity is the same as the activity associated with moral virtues. In Book 10, however, Aristotle revisits the issue of virtuous activity. So we're going to talk about moral virtues and intellectual virtues now. If happiness, he says, is the activity in accordance with virtue, it will be the activity in accordance with the highest virtue. And the highest virtue belongs to the best part of the soul. That is the intellect. The Greek word is nous, or the part that governs in the soul and contemplates the fine and godly, belonging to the gods, being itself the divine part of the soul, or that which is closest to the divine. So we're talking about moral virtues and intellectual virtues. So moral virtues, this would be an excellent family member, an excellent politician, excellent in this taking turns, ruling and being ruled, and intellectual virtues, being a good philosopher, contemplating the perfection of the world around us, this teleologically organized world in which nature does nothing in vain, and everything ultimately has its ergon, its function, and its telos, right, its purpose or aim. Up to this point, Aristotle has apparently been talking about the man of political action. So moral virtues, this is man of political action. Active in the life of the city, this person exercises courage, moderation, liberality, and justice in the public arena. Actually, Aristotle has an interesting criticism of Plato. He says that you cannot be generous unless you have possessions. And the guardians, the philosopher kings, do not have any possessions in Plato's Republic, so they will not have an opportunity to be generous. And like in a certain sense, I feel that Aristotle's objection has a certain traction. And, I am happy to say that this objection does not apply to Marx, because for Marx, when we talk about communism, we're talking about abolition of private property on the means of production. You will still be able to give gifts in communism. So don't worry. You can still exercise charity in communism. be a generous host. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's an important remark. So I mean, in this sense, I think Marx's vision of communism is much more humane and much more closer to what we understand as good life in the Aristotelean sense than Plato's. This rule by saints, this extremely ascetic ideal of the philosopher kings in the Republic. Anyway, active in the life of the city, the excellent person of political action, of moral virtue, exercises courage, moderation, liberality, and justice in the public arena. Now, instead of the life of an effective and successful citizen, Aristotle is holding up the life of study and contemplation as the one that achieves happiness, or the highest happiness, that is highest human good, the activity of the highest virtue. So life of study and contemplation, the one that is most self-sufficient and brings the most pleasure. By the way, as I was reading this a couple years ago, I thought to myself, yeah, life of study is most self-sufficient. I was sitting alone in my room, and I thought, like, I am completely self-sufficient. And then it kind of dawned on me that sort of, again, in this Aristotelian fashion, talking about positive freedom, yeah, but the only reason I am able to study and contemplate is because I'm doing this together with others. So I'm able to study Aristotle because there was an Aristotle for me to study. Again, in this sense, other people do not restrict us, but they enable us. And what would Ring of Gyges do to me? What use is Ring of Gyges in the life of study and contemplation? Like this ring of invisibility, raping, murdering, with no repercussions. I mean, that's not what we're after. That's not what makes us happy. Again, what makes me happy is that there was an Aristotle who wrote his Politics, and then there was Richard Parry who wrote about his Politics, and now I have you, my dear colleagues, with whom I can converse and discuss all of these wonderful things, increasing my understanding. Without this class that I'm teaching, I would not be able to exercise my intellectual virtue, as Aristotle would put it, in the highest possible sense, sort of. And it's true. Like when I read this stuff just for fun during the summer, I don't get the same level of insight as when I'm preparing for a class like this. This teaching a class like this is challenging and is demanding on me, but at the same time, I get the depths of insight that are usually unavailable to me. And I think, again, to me, this is an important, vivid example, biographical example of these philosophical ideas that we are studying. Anyway, so Aristotle is holding up the life of study and contemplation as one that achieves highest human good, the activity of the highest virtue. He even suggests that the life of contemplation is secure against the need for external goods. Life of contemplation may be secure against the need for external goods. So even if you're stricken by disease or you become poor, still you can study and contemplate. Like Diogenes, who lived in a barrel, right? Indeed, at first, he portrays these two lives as so opposite that they seem incompatible. One can express the incompatibility as between an inclusive conception of happiness as a dominant conception. Am I missing something? I'm sorry. No? Inclusive conception of happiness and a dominant conception. Okay, this is complicated. I'm not sure what Richard Parry is driving at. In the former, happiness is the active exercise of all virtues, so this would be the inclusive conception, active exercise of all the virtues, moral and intellectual. And in the latter, the exercise, so a dominant conception, the exercise of intellectual virtues is the sum total of happiness. So happiness is achieved first and foremost through exercise of philosophical virtue, intellectual virtue. And the moral virtues then are have only instrumental value in making contemplative life possible, in making contemplation possible. Only an instrumental. So again, these are two possibilities. In general, it's complicated, and I don't want to make the distinction between this inclusive and dominant conception, right? So is it just the intellectual virtues, or is it intellectual together with the moral virtues? But I think Aristotle would say that, look, the kind of beings that we are, again, outside of the polis, humanly, you can only be a beast. So this life of contemplation is unavailable to us in its own right. We have to engage in a society. We have to take turns ruling and being ruled. Otherwise, we cannot guarantee that we will be able to contemplate tomorrow. So I think that sort of humanly speaking, we have to engage. We are forced to engage in both. the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues, the practical activity and the intellectual contemplative activity. Notice, for Plato would emphasize only the latter. Plato would try to reduce moral virtues to intellectual virtues. Aristotle does not do this. These are two separate activities, maybe even of separate parts of the soul. No, in fact, indeed, of the separate parts of the soul. Intellect is nous, and moral virtue comes from this savvy, phronesis or phronesis. In the end, however, Aristotle palliates the difference, leaving the possibility for some way to harmonize the two. The difference between the two lives are rooted in the different aspects of the soul. Moral virtues belong to the appetites and desires of the sensory soul, the part obviously associated with active political life. When its activities are brought under the guidance and control of excellent practical thought and judgment. The highest virtues, those belonging to scientific or philosophical intellect, belong to theoretical reason. To concentrate on these activities, one must be appropriately disengaged from active political life. While the latter description leads Aristotle to portray a possible kind of human life that partakes of the divine detachment, finally, human life is an indissoluble composite of intellect, reason, sensation, desires, and appetite. So again, humanly, we are forced to confront both our intellect and our reason and our sensations and our desires and our appetite. So intellect would refer to intellectual virtues and reason to practical reason. For Aristotle, strictly speaking, happiness simply is the exercise of the highest virtues, those of theoretical reason and understanding. But even persons pursuing those activities as their highest good, making them central to their lives, will need to remain connected to daily life. So even a philosopher needs to remain connected to daily life and even to political affairs in the community in which they live. Hence, they will possess and exercise the moral virtues and those of practical thought, as well as those other higher virtues throughout their lives. Finally, integration of the moral virtues into happiness is achieved if they are not just instrumental means to happiness, but a part of human happiness, while contemplation remains the most important component. Again, it's also very interesting, Aristotle says that the highest pleasure in life, the highest happiness in life, actually comes from contemplation, from doing things like study or science. And many people will find this controversial, but John Stuart Mill will agree. John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian, would agree, and he would say that ultimately utilitarianism, it can work as a social and political doctrine because this is the nature of human beings, that humans derive the highest pleasure from these non-rival goods, that our highest happiness comes from these essentially consensual activities, where win-win activities like science, like philosophy, like art. Like a great artist paints a wonderful painting, and the great artist should be happy that other people see the painting and appreciate the painting. I mean, obviously, the great art is not done for the sake of money. We tend to think, right? And so, in this sense, John Stuart Mill very much believes in this, even though Isaiah Berlin doesn't exactly use his classification in exactly this way. But I think it's very clear if you read John Stuart Mill that John Stuart Mill is very much an advocate of positive freedom and the idea that human beings very much enable one another's freedom and one another's happiness. Again, and going back to this controversial idea of Aristotle that the highest happiness in life comes from engaging in philosophy. And Aristotle would say that everybody else, people in the street who disagree with this, simply did not have the experience of truly engaging in philosophy. And in a Marxist fashion, I would say that most people don't have this experience because they do not have the time, the leisure time, and the resources to engage in philosophy. Philosophy requires schole, it requires leisure. And most people just don't have leisure to engage in philosophy and to find pleasure in it. Again, like I can tell you, today is my day off, and I am enjoying doing this immensely. But if I was overworked and I came home from doing some other kinds of labor which are not connected to philosophy, I would not be able to do this. I would not be able to enjoy this. Like the only thing I would be able to do is maybe watch funny videos on YouTube or something like that, or whatever people do these days, and just engage in pleasures of the flesh, like eating or something like that. But if that was the case, it's not because somehow pleasures of the body are better than pleasures of philosophy. No, it's just that when you are tired, and if you don't have enough schole, enough free time to cultivate the taste for philosophy, then you will not be able to understand it. You will not be able to exercise it. And to a very large extent, in a Marxist way, I think it's a political problem. And John Stuart Mill says as much. It's a political problem. It's a problem of bad organization of contemporary societies in which we live. That people do not get this opportunity to engage in the activity which will truly make them happy. And again, keep jumping from Aristotle to Mill to Marx. I think all of these analogies are quite appropriate. Although one has to be careful in making such anachronistic parallels. Anyway, so like Plato, Aristotle is a Eudaimonist, in that he argues that virtue, including in some way the moral virtues of courage, justice, and the rest, is the dominant and the most important component of happiness. However, he's not claiming that the only reason to be morally virtuous is that moral virtue is a constituent of happiness. He says that we seek to have virtue and virtuous action for itself as well. So not just because it's going to make us happy, but for its own sake. Virtue for the sake of virtue, excellence for the sake of excellence. Not to do so is to fail even to be virtuous. So an excellent individual would strive for would strive for excellence regardless of whether it's going to make him or her happy or not. It will make him or her happy, but the striving itself has to be irrespective of that. And I'm also always sort of asking these questions to myself, like athletes, winners of Olympic Games, or maybe politicians who run for presidency. Do they really do it for the sake of pleasure, or do they find intrinsic motivation? And I feel it has to be intrinsic motivation. Like if the motivation would not be intrinsic, you would not be able to like super achieve on this highest level. Okay. So like pleasure, virtue is sought for its own sake, still a constituent of happiness. Virtuous action is grounded in the highest end of a human being. Thus Aristotle bases his account of virtue and happiness in his theory about human nature. If happiness is excellent activity of the soul, then excellent activity of the soul is understood in relation to the human function, ergon, and human telos, purpose in life. The purpose, the meaning of human life, the purpose of human existence. Wonderful, right? So you're taking a class in philosophy. So what are we discussing? We're discussing the meaning of life, obviously. Why not? Aristotle assumes that if one understands what the human function is, one can understand what it is for that function to be done excellently. This sort of argument has been criticized because it moves from a premise about what human beings are to a conclusion about what they ought to be. So this is, in some sense, you could say a naturalistic fallacy pointed out by George Edward Moore. Yeah, is this a good criticism? I am not sure. Such criticism reflects the modern claim that there is a fact-value distinction, is or problem. Again, George Edward Moore, or actually goes back to David Hume. Such criticism, one defense of Aristotle's argument holds that his account of human nature is meant both to be objective and to offer the basis for understanding of excellence. The difference, then, between modern moral theory and ancient is over what counts as an objective account of human nature. Finally, as we will see, the idea that virtue is the perfection of human nature becomes an important idea for Stoics. We'll talk about this later for further detailed discussion. There's a wonderful entry on Aristotle's Ethics. I encourage you to look at it if you so desire. Okay, so this last point about fact-value distinction, I don't necessarily want to talk about this now because it's a technical issue. But, I'm with Aristotle on this one. I think Kant very famously says there are three most important questions in life. What should I do? What can I know? And what can I hope for? What should I do? What can I know? And what can I hope for? And these three, Kant says, are reducible to the fourth most important question. What is a human being? And in this sense, sort of from Aristotle to Kant, I think that, ultimately in life, we should base our decisions on our understanding of what we are essentially. Not to say that it's easy or obvious or perfectly clear or uncontroversial what human nature is, but I think at the end of the day we do need some working hypothesis, some kind of a hypothetical definition of what human nature is. It's controversial. It's always been controversial. Probably will always be controversial. And again, I don't necessarily invite you to agree with Aristotle. But this is an important position in the dialogue. And this is a dialogue that we're going to continue with other thinkers in the course this year and next year. Okay, colleagues. So I hope that this was stimulating. I found this a lot of fun, and I definitely found this extremely stimulating. So if you have any questions or comments, I would be more than happy to hear them. Otherwise, thank you so much for keeping company. I hope you're all staying safe. And I will see you. I'll see many of you, I think, tomorrow. And until next time, take care. Take care. Again, now you understand the meaning of this phrase. Philosophy should be to the soul what medicine is to the body. This is the ancient Greek way. Okay, and we're going to end here.